days the British were controlling everything and times were hard, and it was hard to make a living. My parents died when I was young. And how old are you? How old are you? You're 7? Okay. Well, when I was young, your age, I was sent from families to friends, for my food and stuff like that so they could raise me. But when I was 10, I became something called an indentured servant. Does anybody know what that means? Any of the parents know what that means? It means I was given to another family. And from the time I was 10 years old till I was 18, I had to work hard for this family so I could have food, and so I had a place to sleep, a safe place to sleep. But I was smart. I could read, and I read everything I could get my hands on because knowledge keeps moving you forward. So I read, and by the time I was about 20, I qualified to be a teacher. So about then, though, the revolution's been going on for a few years. And I was used to hard work. I worked hard on the farm. And I was tall for a girl. I was 5'7", a little bit taller than I am now. But anyway, I was 5'7". And I was a good shot, too. And I just couldn't sit there and let the war go without me. So I came up with a plan. And I was handy with the needle. And I sewed myself a suit of clothes because they didn't let women in the war in those days. And I sewed a man's suit. And I walked 30 miles to join with Captain George Webb's Light Infantry Unit, 4th Regiment, Massachusetts Continental Line. And I had to make up a dress. I certainly couldn't sign up saying my name was Deborah, so I made up a name, George Shirtleff. I don't know, maybe it was because I had sewn that man's shirt. And Shirtleff sounded like a good name to me, and that's the one I decided to use. My first battle was near a place called Tarrytown, New York, Tappan Zee. And I held my own. I was fighting and doing everything I could. But someone caught me with a saber over the left side of my head. But I didn't want to go to the doctor because I was afraid, if I went to the doctor, they'd find out I was a woman. So I got some bandages, got some cloth, and I treated it myself. But I kept going. Shortly after that, I was in another battle. But this time, I got hit in the leg with 2 musket balls, kind of like little marbles. And they went straight into my leg. And this time, there was not any going to the doctor, at least not according to the other men in my unit. And they picked me up and they carried me off to the hospital, or to the mess. But the wound in my head was still kind of, I don't mean to be gross, but it was still kind of, So I pointed to the doctor and said, here's my problem. So that doctor kind of cleaned up my head and worked on it a little bit. I never said a word one about my leg. And I'm sorry, little ones, I hope this isn't too rough. But I went, so I went all by myself, kind of further out in the woods. And with my penknife, and I told you I was handy with a needle, I could get one of those balls out of my leg all by myself, but the other one was too deep and I couldn't get it. And that thing troubled me the whole rest of my life. I suffered with that musket ball. In 1783, my whole unit was moved down to Philadelphia. And I became an orderly under a man named General John Patterson. And I was his orderly, and things were going pretty good. It was a little bit easier duty for me. But I don't know if it was because maybe over time, that wound in my leg, or maybe a sickness, but I got a real bad fever. And it rendered me unconscious. So then I was taken to the doctor again. And it was during that time that doctor did figure out I was a girl. But he didn't tell anybody. But you can't keep secrets like that forever, and eventually I was found out. Well, General Patterson went ahead and told General Knox. And General Knox went ahead and told General George Washington himself. And I was real scared. I didn't know what was going to happen. Was I going to get thrown in the brig? What would they do to me? But I was, was I going to go to jail for fib telling? I didn't know. But I was real surprised because my commanders provided letters of testifying to my gallantry in battle. And so General George Washington ordered them to give me a dishonorable discharge, and I was real proud of those letters. And the war was coming to an end anyway, so I didn't really miss that much action after that. In 1785, I finally met a man, Mr. Benjamin Gannett, and he was a farmer. We had 3 kids, so that was real good, and I was very careful with them for their education. But like I said, times are still, with the war going on, there's not much stuff, you can't make a whole lot of money. And so a friend of mine, Mr. Paul Revere, said, you know what? I think he probably called me Bobby just to have fun. He goes, Bobby, Deborah, Robert, you ought to go on tour. And so back in those days, I kind of became one of the first female orators, not only one of the first female soldiers, but an orator to go tell my story, because no one had ever heard of the likes of me. I was the only one I knew about. There may have been others, but they weren't telling me. So I went around to crowds, and they would come, and I'd tell my story about the battle at Tappan Zee, about my leg, about serving General Patterson, and the crowds loved it. And then I would leave the stage, and I'd put on my uniform, and I'd come back out. No one ever seen a real woman in uniform. And I'd come out, and I'd take my musket, and I'd show them my drills, you know, and I'd show them what I could do. No one ever saw a female doing that before. Never saw it. And the crowd would go crazy, and they'd clap for me, and it was wonderful. Helped me make a little money to help my family survive. I still had trouble, though, with that leg. And so in 1805, Paul Revere went to the state of Massachusetts and asked that I be given a military pension. So back in those days, it was you know, it was some money. It wasn't a lot. It's even less today. I got $4 a month for my military service and my leg. But I was real proud to serve. So anyway, I want to tell you about my friend that did these things to me. Got me on speaking tours, got me a pension, Mr. Paul Revere. You want to hear about him? You don't know all the story. A lot of people don't know the whole story. Yes, ma'am.
I've read some of the stories in the poems in a book.
That's right. Well,
I've heard the whole
listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride, Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is still alive that remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friends, should the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang our lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the old North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Now that poem goes on a long way. Does anybody know who that poem was written by?
Paul Revere?
No. It was written 40 years after Paul Revere's death by a name of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Have you ever said anything that rhymes and somebody tells you a funny little joke? Like if you say 2 words that rhyme and you didn't mean to do it, and they say, you're a poet and you don't know it, but your feet surely show it because they're Longfellows? That's what they're talking about, Longfellow. And thank God for him, because if he had never written that poem, we might not even remember Paul Revere today. He kind of made it immortal, but he was a poet, so he did a little bit of, he took poetic license because he couldn't fit the whole story in the poem. And that's why I'm here today, is to tell you more of that story. All right? So anyway, in 1774, in Boston, there was rebellion in the air because the British had kept its oppression, and this had been going on for years. They were doing things like taking the people's money without asking, or asking for just a little bit too much, and they were giving it to the English to support England. It wasn't used back for the colonies. They didn't let, pretty much, and it still goes on today. They did things like I'm an elected official. They didn't let them have their elected officials. They appointed people. And instead of telling about what the people wanted, it was the commands of the king. And they even took soldiers, that people had to take soldiers in their homes, feed them, clothe them, provide them their food. This kind of things. And the people were getting rebellious about it. They didn't like it. So there was a doctor, Dr. Joseph Warren. He wrote a thing, it's really just a bunch of papers, you know, you write down something that's making you mad. So he wrote these things called the Suffolk Resolves, and in the end of it, he was telling the people not to cooperate. Don't pay your taxes. Buy clothes that were made here in the U.S. Don't buy things that were coming from England, because that's the other thing. We couldn't buy anything unless it came off an English ship. We couldn't sell anything unless it went out on an English ship. And there was a whole world out there where we could sell our goods, and we weren't allowed to do it. We couldn't make enough money. So anyway, we went on, and this message was sent by Paul Revere. He took his words. What he said was, a king that abuses his people. Do you think he deserves to keep being their king? No. And that's what these papers said. So he took those papers down to the Continental Congress that was meeting. And the Congress, that means all the other colonies that were gathered. They agreed to come to the aid of the state of the colony of Massachusetts if it came to conflict, if it came to war, if the soldiers started moving against the colonists. So time passed, and during that time, Dr. Joseph Warren, what he was doing is he was getting the people to form their militias, to start training just in case, and starting gathering things like weapons and ammo and things like that, just in case. So then that spring, and they knew it was coming, on the 15th of April, the Governor General of Massachusetts, they didn't get elected their governor, he was appointed, and he was a military man. His name was Thomas Gage. He was given an order. He was told to go to Lexington and arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams. You ever heard these names before? Remember on the Constitution, in big letters, John Hancock signed that Constitution, right? And Samuel Adams. So anyway, they were supposed to go and arrest him. And then they were supposed to go to Concord to take all the weapons that the colonists had been gathering, to take their military stores. Well, General Gage tried to keep this a big secret in Boston. Well, what is Boston? Is it a little town or is it a big city? It's a big city. And there's people everywhere. So the rebels, that would be us, the rebels noticed that the British were doing something. They were taking all their little boats out of the water. The soldiers could get in and move across the river and land on the other side. They were taking all these boats out and fixing them all at once. What do you think the rebels thought about that? What do you think that might have told them? They see all this stuff, that something was about to happen, right? They're all fixing getting ready. So on the 16th of April, Paul Revere went, and he went to a place called, well, first he went to Concord, and he warned the people, hey, we think something's happening. The redcoats are going to come, and they're going to take all your stores, and they're going to arrest you. So the townspeople started hiding their stuff in their barns, in the swamps, up the trees, down the weapons, even their jewelry, their silver, anything of value, because that could have been taken too to raise more money for the king. And also their weapons, so they couldn't defend themselves. So we warned them. And then he went on to a town called Charleston to come up with this plan, how to tell the people on the other side when the British were coming. And so what was that plan? Does anybody remember? It was to go, you tell them, yes. No, how were they going to tell the people? What was the warning? Yes. Yeah.
The signal tower.
Absolutely right. Correct. It was to hang those signal lights. So they came up with that plan. And then he came back. So then a few days later, on the 18th of April, just like it says in the poem, on the 18th of April, Dr. Warren got news that the British were about to move, and they were going to land on a place called Leclerc's Point. So he knew they were ready. So he didn't call one person. He didn't just call Paul Revere. He called another one. The first man he called was a man named William Dawes. And I don't know how they knew each other. William Dawes was not associated with the movement. He wasn't part of the Sons of Liberty. He never spoke out. As a matter of fact, this guy, William Dawes, he was kind of the town funny guy. And forgive me, parents, but he was the town funny guy. And what he was famous for, much to the aggravation of his wife, because he wasn't a drinker, but he'd like to pretend and make people laugh by pretending to be a drunk farmer. Okay? He'd run around town and embarrass people and say funny things. This was Mr. William Dawes, and he got the first message. So he was called in at 9 o'clock by Dr. Warren. He was given the message, so they put him on a horse, but they didn't put him on a racing horse. They put him on a slow, kind of jogging horse, maybe even a gaited horse. And they put all kinds of bags on this horse. They put him in a big coat and a big floppy hat. Well, none of this yelling and riding. Why do they think they wanted him to go quietly? Any ideas?
Does the British would know?
Exactly, perfect. That's right. He could get tried and hanged as a traitor if the British would find him. So he didn't need to be going around screaming. The ultimate goal was for him to get to Lexington. So he just looked like a regular travel. And so he went. And he went, William Dawes, this is Boston, and here's Boston next. He took this route. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Well, we'll talk about it right now. There were two ways that the British could go. They could go this way by land, and this is the way that Dawes went first. But what do you think some of the disadvantages are to have to march all this way? It's a long way. That's right, right? It's a long way. So it would take them longer, plus the people would see them quicker. You know, that element of surprise. If you see, hey, the British are coming, we see them, right? But that was one way. And the doctor was smart. He wanted two different people to go ahead of them two different ways, just so at least one of them could make it in case one was arrested. So this way. The second way was going to be to go across the river. And that was Paul Revere's way. And he gave them both the same message. Paul Revere went, and he would go this way. So he would come, and he would take the river and go. So anyway, so what happened? The two, Paul Revere and Dawes, would reach their points roughly at the same time, but kind of had a little different story. Paul Revere's journey was almost stopped before it was started, right? Because he had to go, there was a great big ship called the Somerset, big man of warship, parked there. And he had to get on a boat first and row his way across. But here's the problem. Those oars are noisy and make a lot of noise, and he had to go quiet, and he had forgotten to take rags. He will take rags so to quiet the oars, but he forgot them. Now the legend told is that one of his oarsmen convinced his girlfriend to lend a petticoat, and so they could tear the petticoat and use it. But that's a legend, I can't prove it, and the girlfriend never told the story. But anyway, so he was able to quietly go across and start that. So what happened? They get to Lexington roughly within 30 minutes of each other, and they had a rest and got some food, and they warned, why did they go to Lexington first? And where did they go? Does anybody know whose house they went to? No? It was a Reverend Jonas Clark, Reverend Jonas Clark. And the reason why is because it was his congregation that served as the militia. So when he rang the church bells, all the townspeople knew to come and congregate there with their weapons because there was danger. And also because that is where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. So he warned them. So after they gave out the warnings, they started to take off again. But they were joined by a third rider. And his name was Dr. Samuel Prescott. And he just saw them, knew what they were doing, and he wanted to join to help. And we'll see later how important that was. So now they're taking off at fast speed now. They were careful before, but now they're going, and they're telling all the villagers they're going to the farms. And they ran into a British patrol. And the three men had three very different faiths. Paul Revere was captured first, but you didn't know that. He was captured first. And under interrogation, he did a little fib telling of his own. And he told those British, he greatly exaggerated how many militiamen the British would face when they came. So the British are thinking they are going to have, they're going to have a big fight on their hands, is what they thought. But this helped him later because as his escorts were taking him back, I guess they were going to take him back to Lexington to put in prison, they heard the church bell ring. And then the two men that were taking him, the two Brits, they heard shots fired. And they went, well, what is that? He goes, they're warning the militia. So the two British soldiers, they got scared. And they were afraid that if the local people found them with Paul Revere, that they'd end up in trouble and get hurt or get put in prison. So they just took off. But what they did, pay attention to this because I'm going to ask about it later, they took his horse and they traded it for a tired horse so that it took him longer to get back to Lexington, okay? So what happened to Mr. Dawes, the second man? You remember my funny man? All right, well, Mr. Dawes, he was being pursued, and the British were chasing him down. But he was smart, and he knew that the next house, it was like, darn it, this next house, it was an abandoned home. But he was smart, and so what he did, he ran straight for that house on his horse, and he stopped his horse so fast, I don't think he meant to do this part, but he got, what do you think happened when he stopped his horse really fast? He flew off end over end and fell into the ground, but he jumped up really fast, and to this empty house, he's screaming, all right, boys, I've got him! Get him! Well, when those two soldiers that were chasing him heard that, they thought they were about to be captured, and they took off at high speed, turned around, and they left him. There was only one problem. He scared his horse so bad when he yelled like that. Where do you think his horse went? His horse went with him and followed the other British soldiers. So there he was left to limp all the way back on foot to Lexington. So, Paul Revere can't get to Concord. William Dawes can't get to Concord. Who's the last one? Dr. Samuel Prescott. Now, has anybody here ever taken horseback riding lessons?
No.
No? Well, some of you have. All right, and what do they tell you? What do you use a lot to steer your horse?
Reins.
Legs. Well, and also your legs. And here's what, you're right, you also use your reins, but here's what happened. When that patrol came and they had a little bit of a battle, his horse had his bridle cut with the saber. So he had none of this. But he must have been an excellent rider because he did it all. And he went high speed. And how he got away from the British was that he jumped his horse with no reins over a high stone wall. And then he took off at high speed and he went to Concord, and the people were warned. And they were able to take their positions and take their defenses in time before the British got there. Sad thing for Dr. Prescott is that he was captured later in the war. He was sent to a prison in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he did die in prison. But without him, who knows how that story would end. But let's go back to Lexington now. Okay, so they've been warned, and now we're at Lexington Green. The militia comes, and they're under the command of a young Jonathan Parker. It's his militia that's waiting for the British, under the command of a Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Now, nobody knows who fired the first shot. Any guesses? I mean, nobody really knows. But what happened was, when the British started fighting, they killed 8 militiamen right away. 10 were wounded, so they ran to the forest to avoid their fire. And then the British started to turn, and they were going to Concord. But there was one more rider that hardly anybody knows about. The last rider, his name was Wentworth Cheswell. And not many people know about him. He's different. He was an American of African descent. And in about 1711, his granddaddy earned his freedom, or had his freedom, and went off and I guess apparently ended up being fairly well-to-do because Wentworth grew up to go to private school in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts colony. And he studied Greek, Latin, the 3 R's, and horsemanship. And he was a very good rider. And so Wentworth became one of the very first African Americans to be elected into office, right, as the town constable. So he was seen a lot on horseback, and he carried secret messages back and forth between the colonies. All right. So what he did when everybody else moved this way to warn the townsmen, he went north. And so he went north, and there were enough militiamen started coming from the north to aid those in Lexington and Concord, though most of their work was done along the route of the British retreat as they were headed back to Boston. So these the British lost 20% of their forces that day, or of that group that day. And that started the siege against Boston. And that, my friends, is when the American Revolution started. And let me ask you a few questions. You ever wonder? First off, anybody want to guess the name? This is kind of a trick question. Anyone want to know the name of Paul Revere's horse?
Yes.
What?
I don't know. I just thought when you said, does anybody want to know his name?
Oh, anybody have a guess?
Henry.
No, that's a good one though.
I call my horse Thunder. His name
Do
is
ya? What color's your horse?
He's a color's in brownish black, but he's very fast because sometimes he'll run away from me, or sometimes he'll run and knock me down because when he sees a carrot, he'll just run. He's fast, that's why I call him Thunder.
Okay. Well, here it's a trick question because Paul Revere didn't even have a horse, so he went to borrow a horse from his friend. But his friend didn't even have a horse. His friend had to borrow a horse from his father. Brown Betty is what they think the name is. They found some paperwork that must verify it. But anybody can tell me whatever happened to that horse?
It died.
Well, we're all going to join that horse someday. But does anybody remember what happened to that horse? Did the guy get his horse back?
No.
Why?
Because it ran off. I guess.
That's you are. This kid's listening. You are awesome. That's right. Remember the British traded horses. They took the horse. So the British now had Brown Betty and she was never heard from again.
That was sad.
Hey, huh?
Ow.
Dad was probably mad. That's right. That's right. And we don't even know. I mean, maybe, who knows what the other horse was that he got back. He was tired. Hopefully they meant just tired and not old and decrepit. But did anybody give any thought to that guy that climbed up into the church?
No.
Think that might have been a dangerous job?
Yeah.
Yeah, because what do you think would happen if the soldiers had caught him putting up those signal lights?
Fall down.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty hard thing to
Soldiers
say.
would go up there and stuff.
That's right, but besides that, what do you think if the British caught him doing it?
Yeah, that would be a very bad way.
They're treason, right? And we don't need to go into the cost of treason there again. But anyway, so anybody have a guess of who put those lights up there?
No.
No? Nope, not Paul Revere. He was waiting for those lights. He was riding, huh?
The people that were getting all their weapons to
Yeah, that's a good guess, but they were out here. Any other guesses? It was the church caretaker.
I knew that.
He was the man, that was responsible for taking care of the church, making sure it was clean. Why? Well, they'd always expect to see him there. But here's the thing. When they went up, guess what? They couldn't see who was putting those lights on, but they knew someone was. And the British started running to that church. He started running down out of that tower, and he jumped out a window out of the Old North Church. Now the Old North Church, the Old North Church actually burnt down, but they rebuilt it. But to this day, there's a plaque. If you go up there, and it says Newman's Window. The caretaker's name was Mr. Robert Newman. So all these patriots, these the quiet people, the doctor that just wanted to join in because he was visiting his girlfriend, and then, then the town funny man, and the church caretaker. It's just action. Paul Revere. Does anybody know what Paul Revere did for a living? He was a silversmith. These weren't famous, strong military people. These were normal, everyday working folks and farmers and pastors that fought against the biggest military at that time, the best equipped military in the world, so that we could celebrate the 4th of July. That's right. Is anybody going to go to the big, I guess you're having a big carnival. Is it open tonight?
Yes.
I think that's what you were telling me. And you guys have tons of fun. I guess you have some important business to attend to.
Let's thank Miss Rogers again.